Today, we are diving into the latest SEBI amendments on related party transactions, or RPTs, for listed entities. But I promise, these changes are all about making compliance more practical. What really pushed for these updates this time around?
These changes were approved on the 12th of September 2025, notified on November 18, and they'll kick in from December 18. The big idea here is to make compliance more practical and clear.
Exactly. One of the headline changes is the introduction of scale-based thresholds for material-related party transactions. No more one-size-fits-all. Now the limits depend on the size of the company's turnover, and subsidiaries are getting special attention too.
Then, reporting for smaller transactions up to TA 10 crore has been simplified. That's a relief for companies dealing with routine, lower-value deals, and shareholder approvals have also been clarified. Omnibus approvals for material RPTs are valid until the next AGM, or for 1 year if passed in an EGM. Then, another important tweak. The definition of related party now includes key managerial personnel and their relatives, not just directors and employees. And don't forget the disclosure side. Companies must provide web links or QR codes for holders of non-convertible securities who haven't registered their emails. Finally, SEBI clarified that when they say holding company, they mean a listed holding company. So overall, these amendments tighten governance but also make compliance smoother, a balanced move by SEBI.
On determination of materiality, instead of one-size-fits-all, the new approach tailors rules based on a company's size and the transaction scale. It's like moving from a generic shirt to a tailor-made suit. It actually fits what you need. Speaking of that tailored approach, can you break down this new scale-based threshold? I've seen a lot of numbers tossed around, and it gets pretty dense.
Let's untangle it. So, let's start with the new scale-based thresholds for material RPTs. SEBI's moving away from this old one-size-fits-all approach. Previously, it was just, pick the lower of U1,000 crore or 10% of annual consolidated turnover, and that was the threshold. It didn't care if you were a boutique firm or a giant the size of Everest. Now, though, they have introduced a tiered formula, where your threshold actually grows as your company grows, which honestly feels overdue. For example, if a company clocks an annual consolidated turnover of U30,000 crore, we no longer just slap on a flat 10%. Instead, according to the new model, you start with 2,000 crore and then add 5% of the turnover that exceeds 20,000 crore. That means for our U30,000 crore company, the threshold is higher 2,500 crore, not just a chunky arbitrary figure. Makes you feel like the system's finally acknowledging scale, right? Once you're bigger, the formula changes, adding a base and a smaller percentage for the extra amount.
That sounds a lot more logical. A giant company shouldn't have to report the same way as a mid-sized one. On this base, if you are a SME, the thresholds are proportionately smaller, lower, of 10% of consolidated turnover, or 50 crore. So it is not like anyone's forgotten the little guys.
For sure. There's also a new requirement that any transaction above Q1 crore involving a subsidiary needs audit committee approval, even if the main company isn't technically part of the deal. That plugs a pretty big oversight.
As far as brand royalty or usage fees cross 5% of consolidated turnover, they're automatically treated as material no matter the company's scale, as those can be big numbers, so it's smart to keep extra eyes them. And SEBI has not touched this threshold, and no amendment is introduced. Now, building on that foundation, let's talk about those subsidiaries and the new focus on significant transactions. Previously, there was this, let's call it a blind spot in the rules. If a subsidiary entered an RPT that was big enough to cross the parent company's materiality threshold, say, over 2,500 crore in our earlier example, but didn't quite hit 10% of the subsidiary's own turnover, you could have this odd scenario where shareholder approval was needed but not audit committee approval. Yeah, it's as awkward as it sounds. So, SEBI stepped in. Now, any RPT by a subsidiary that breaches lower of 10% of its standalone turnover, or the newer threshold, gets classified as significant and, crucially, must go before the listed entity's audit committee for greenlighting.
So, let's imagine. Our holding company has 40,000 crore turnover, and hence threshold as per the newer scale-based threshold is rupees 2,500 crore if subsidiary has 27,000 crore turnover and they're eyeing a transaction worth 2,600 crore. As per the older regime computation, it would not require the approval of the audit committee since its 10% threshold was rupees 2,700 crore though. It requires shareholders' approval. Now, with the lower of 10% test or new scale-based threshold, anything over 2,500 crore gets flagged.
Interesting. So, if a subsidiary's standalone turnover is huge, if the RPT is lower of 10%, or the new scale-based materiality threshold of listed company, it still need approval of the audit committee of the listed entity, as well as the listed company shareholders?
Here's the approval threshold would be whichever is lower 10% of the subsidiary's turnover. If the subsidiary has completed 1 year and has audited financials for the year, or a formula involving share capital and premium, if the subsidiary does not completed 1 year, sets the bar.
Let's shift gears a bit. For a lot of smaller companies, did SEBI make things any easier for the little guys or for low-value deals? SEBI's latest changes bring some real relief for smaller or low-risk transactions.
They did, actually. For RPTs up to 20 crore, there's now simplified reporting. That cuts down unnecessary paperwork for truly minor deals. Now, for basic disclosure, the bar has been set at the lower of 1% of the listed entity's annual consolidated turnover or 10 crore. If you're just under that line, there's no extra paperwork. The compliance burden gets lighter, not heavier.
That's a relief. Sometimes, compliance becomes a full-time job for what amounts to pocket change in big companies.
Absolutely, it cuts down on repetitive paperwork.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on exemptions and exclusions. Just as a recap, there's a much clearer list of what's exempt. Deals between a listed holding company and its wholly owned subsidiary. Transactions between two wholly owned subsidiaries. Anything involving two PSUs, or between a PSU and the government, and even statutory payments like regulatory fees or charges.
More list covering dividends, rights issues, things offered uniformly to all shareholders are excluded.
Rightly said, as those are routine corporate actions, preferential issues, fixed deposit acceptances, even retail purchases by directors or relatives, those all have clear guidelines now, so there's less room for confusion.
It really does. These new standards might actually make life simpler instead of harder. So, to wrap things up, SEBI's changes aren't about adding layers, they're about smarter, clearer oversight that finally reflects company realities, making life easier for everyone from compliance officers.
Thanks. The details on the applicability of industry standards on related party transactions will be discussed separately.